Hello everyone, I hope you guys are doing well. Today we got another fantastic video for you. Have you ever heard of the 13-Year War? Well, the war started out as an uprising by Prussian cities and local nobles against the Teutonic Knights. You might have guessed from the name that this bloody war carried on for 13 years. So, let us take a look at the events and the reason behind this conflict. In the 15th century, the states of Prussia saw the rapid development of their cities. However, this development did not translate into an increase in their political power. The rule of the Teutonic Knights was increasingly even seen as more and more anachronistic. Increasing taxes and the system of grain licenses were hindering economic progress in the region. The grain licenses were a mandatory fee that every trader had to pay for attaining the privilege of selling grain. At the same time, the local nobility and the public were looking for more say in how their country was run. They looked to neighboring Poland for inspiration, as the Polish nobles enjoyed a larger degree of freedom and privileges. The Teutons themselves weren't model rulers and had often been accused of violating the few existing rights of the gentry in cities under their control. Even the craftsmen weren't happy, as this faced stiff competition from the so-called partace, that is, artisans who had been settled by the Teutons near their castles. With time, the Kashubians, Poles, Germans, and Prussians had all started to melt into one nation. The differences were slowly sliding away, and shared goals of all ethnicities and social groups within Prussia were becoming more prominent. The western part of Prussia was called Pomerelia at the time, and it was the spot where the principal city of Danzig, Gdansk, was situated. This city had initially been captured by Duke Boleslaus I of Poland and had been ruled by Pomeranian and Brandenburg dukes until the Teutonic Order took over the land. With time, the link with Poland soon started to increase as strong cultural and trading contracts developed. The marriages between elite families of Krakow, Danzig, and Torn further deepened these ties. Krakow was a Hanseatic League city as well, and had many German craftsmen and inhabitants at the time. The relations to Poland might not have been a direct cause of war, but this factor later achieved paramount importance. There had been a long tradition of resistance against the Teutonic Knights in Prussia. In 1397, knights from Prussia had formed a secret order called the Eidechsenbund, the Band of Lizards. Their motives and goals had been anti-Teutonic, but since the lack of urban support, they had failed. During the Great War of 1409 to 1411, a victory of the Polish and Lithuanian forces saw many Prussian states eagerly pledge their alliance to the Polish King Władysław Jagiello, but they quickly returned when the king's forces had been unable to conquer Marienburg. A clause in the treaty signed after the war had stated that Prussian states could rebel against the Teutonic Order in case of breach of the terms of the treaty. As a result of future wars, Prussian states opposed conflict and pushed the Grand Masters of the Order to make peace. On February 21, 1440, a group made up of individuals from the Prussian cities, gentry, and clergy formed the Prussian Confederation. The main contributors were from the nobility of Kulmerland, Torn, and Kulm, and from Hanseatic cities of Elbing and Danzig. Grand Master Paul Rusdorf seemed to approve of the Confederacy, but his successor Konrad von Ehrlichhausen tried to destroy it. The policy was followed by Ludwig von Ehrlichhausen. In 1452, the Prussian Confederation had asked Frederick III, the Holy Roman Emperor, for mediation, but the move had seemingly backfired, as the emperor did not seem to care for the demands and requests of the Confederation and banned the organization and ordered them to follow the will of the Teutonic Order. Disappointed, the Confederacy sent a delegation to Poland to ask for help. They received support from Greater Poland and from the party of Queen Sophia, the mother of the King of Poland, Casimir IV. However, the Cardinal Bishop of Krakow opposed the move and tried to prevent war. In January, the Prussians asked Poland to make their land part of itself. However, the king asked them to issue a more formal petition. On February 4th, 1454, the Confederacy that had retreated to safer bound sent a formal act of disobedience. 2 days later, they started their rebellion, and soon all cities except Marienburg, Sturm, and Konitz were free from Teutonic rule. Most of the captured castles were razed to the ground, and on February 10th, the Confederacy sent an official delegation to Poland. Here, Jan Baczynski managed to convince the king about the benefits of adding Prussia to the list, and on March 6th, the delegation from Prussia pledged allegiance to the Polish king. On the same day, he decided to agree to all the terms and conditions of the Confederacy. 3 days later, Jan Baczynski became the first Polish governor of Prussia, and by April 15th, most of the Prussian state, except the bishopric of Ermland, had pledged allegiance to their new ruler. Poland officially sent a declaration of war to the Grand Master, and the war finally began. The first land operations were carried out by the Prussian state conscripts, supported by Czech mercenaries from Moravia and Lesser Poland. This force, commanded by Stibor Baczynski von Beißen, tried to besiege the Grand Master Ludwig von Erlichhausen in the city and castle of Malbork. But the attack wasn't successful, as the opposing force was commanded by Heinrich Reuss von Plauen, the Count of Elbing, who was an experienced commander. Meanwhile, the Teutonic Knights were supported by forces from the German duchies. The army entered Prussia in the second half of March 1454 and was able to take over the important and strategic city of Chojnice. The city was located en route to Poland. Johannes von Beußen moved his conscript and mercenary forces there and was soon followed by Mikołaj Sarlecki, who was the representative of the Polish kingdom and soon received the title of Supreme Commander of the forces of Prussia. The same year, the Teutons gave Neumark to Brandenburg as a way to secure Germany's loyalty. At the end of April 1454, the Prussian army laid siege to Chojnice. The city was defended by Heinrich Reuss the Younger. However, the Prussian commander was not experienced and lacked adequate artillery support, and nor could they pay their mercenaries. Thus, the city wasn't threatened. Soon, Casimir IV arrived after he had taken the oath of allegiance from his new subjects in Elbing and Torn. He directed a large conscript army of Polish nobles to replace the mercenaries at Chojnice. However, these cavalry forces were ill-suited to the requirements of the siege, and the city was able to withstand the assaults. The Prussian reinforcements were later relocated to Malbork after they took Sturm. The Teutons were able to defend themselves skillfully and were even able to defeat the forces from Danzig when they launched a sudden attack on September 13. The position of the Polish crown was getting increasingly precarious, and it got even worse when an army of 9,000 cavalry and 6,000 infantry plus artillery arrived in Prussia from the German Reich. The army was commanded by Rudolf, Prince of Zagat, as the German forces started to move towards Chojnice. Left with no other choice, the Polish King Casimir called for mass conscription of Greater Poland without the traditional approval of the provincial Sejmik. The nobles were angered by this disruption in the period of harvest and by the breach of the traditional system. They gathered near the village of Cerekwica and demanded from the king several privileges which were granted in the privilege of Cerekwica. After Poland had gathered its forces, the army marched to Chojnice, where the Prussians joined them. There they met the Teutonic army on September 18, 1454. The battle was a disaster for the Polish, as they were badly defeated and soon withdrew their forces from Malbork, and Sturm was recaptured by the Teutons. They were also able to capture other major cities, and soon some Prussian states, impressed by the Teuton victories, decided to change sides. Things looked good for the Teuton order, but the only problem was that they had no money to pay the mercenaries. The Grand Master promised them that if they weren't paid by February the next year, they would be given the Prussian cities and lands with the rights to sell them. Mercenaries later captured Quizdien and Königsberg, but none of the larger Prussian cities surrendered, and the Teutons were forced to rely on the German Reich for support. To manage the situation, the Polish king called for another levy en masse conscription from the whole Polish kingdom. After negotiation and such, a 6,000-strong Polish army was sent to Prussia. This time, the mercenaries had some good commanders, like Jan Skalski. The Teutons believed that direct war would be risky and retreated to the cities. The Polish army laid siege to Lasin. The Polish army once again failed miserably, and the first round of negotiations with the Teutons begun, which was a failure. The situation had worsened for King Casimir, as he had to now borrow from the clergy to pay the troops. He gave 2 cities in Pomerania to Eric II in an effort to secure Pomerania. He then had to go to Lithuania to calm down the opposition. In this time, the Teutons were able to take most of eastern Prussia. The last eastern in Prussia loyal to the Polish also fell after a long siege by the Teutons, commanded by Henrik Reuss the Elder, in June. Things were looking bad for the Polish, but the situation wasn't good for the Teutons either, who had still been unable to pay the mercenaries. So they took Malbork, Chu, and Liowa and began negotiations with Poland on selling these castles. The Holy Roman Emperor banned the Prussian Confederacy, and later his successor warned that he would excommunicate the Prussians and their allies if they did not settle peace with the Teutons. In 1455, the Teutons found a new ally in the form of the King of Denmark, who declared war on Poland and the Prussian Confederacy. Shocked by the loss of Kniepawa, King Casimir called for another conscription movement and once again gathered a large Polish army. However, this military action was halted as the king finally agreed to mediation. However, the talks soon broke down, and once again, war resumed. The Polish, now strengthened by a small auxiliary Tartar force, laid siege to Lasin, but once again failed. On the other hand, the Teutons continued to take city after city, but their offensive was often disrupted by rebellions. In the water, King Casimir ordered Gdansk to build a fleet to hamper Teutonic relations over these. In 1457, 3 ships sent by Gdansk were able to defeat 16 Danish and infant ships. Meanwhile, after long negotiations, the Teuton mercenaries were able to sell 3 Polish castles, which were given to the Polish army. Optimism was at its peak as Polish forces moved to the Teuton capital. However, the offensive failed, as the Polish were defeated back-to-back in 2 battles. Once again, the Polish king called for conscription and another army was sent to Prussia. The situation got more complex with time as rebellion broke in Polish lands. The rebels gave some castle to the Teutons and promised to fight on their side. Meanwhile, the King of Poland used John Giskra as a mediator, and 9 months of ceasefire was declared to discuss peace terms. But these effectively broke down and war resumed. The Pope tried to intervene to stop the conflict, but his efforts similarly failed. The first phase of the conflict saw an overwhelming Teuton victory, while the Polish only had been able to capture the castle of Świecie. On the sea, they saw more success, but the main battles up till then had been fought on land. As the second phase began, the Polish launched an offensive and managed to capture the castles of Lasin and Stum. The Teutons, meanwhile, captured a few cities and castles in Brodnice and Starograd. In July 1463, the siege of Gniew was started by the Polish. Knowing the importance of the city, the Teutons launched a counterattack. The 2 armies met in a naval battle known as the Battle of Zatoka Świeca. 44 Teuton ships were destroyed by 30 ships from Danzig and Elbing. Soon after, a Teuton commander made a treaty with Poland and retreated. Meanwhile, the city of Gniew fell. The Teutons faced severe financial problems. They couldn't pay their army, which meant they could go on the offensive while the Polish continued to make progress. However, in 1462, the Lithuanians rejected the earlier conditions set for the Teutons, and a fresh round of negotiations followed at Thorn. Once again, negotiations broke down and the war continued. But in 1466, The Polish forces got reinforced by Bishop Legendorf of Ermland, and soon Chojnice also fell. The Teutons were now forced to come to the table once more, and with Pope Paul II as mediator, the Peace of Thorn was finally signed. Prussia, as a whole, was incorporated into Poland. The Teutons could rule the eastern part as vassals of the Polish state, while the Grand Master received the title of Senator of the Polish Kingdom. This treaty changed the Polish legal system and can be considered a huge victory for the Poles and the people of Prussia. So that's all the time we had today, folks. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel to view more of our amazing videos. And don't forget to hit the bell icon to remain updated about all our future videos. We'll see you with a new video next time. Till then, adios.